Okay, now I'd like to talk about GMOs and genetic engineering and biotech. And I would like to talk about and explore actually, why the resistance to it. Because as I've mentioned earlier, the adoption of these technologies has already delivered so much good, for the world and for the environment, and yet they're at risk. The farmers of the world are suffering from an inability to access this technology. And as Dr. Borlaug opined 20 years ago, he was very fearful that these technologies would be withheld from farmers of the world and thereby deprive the world of producing enough food to feed humanity and depriving the environment of us being able to use less for more. And we talked about that earlier as well. So, what is it about GMOs that has driven the world sort of crazy, It's, okay, so why I want to talk about it? Well, I would like to, my goal would be that as we understand more about the resistance and this passionate sort of zealotry against the use of technology in food, if we can come to grips with why this exists, right? What is the underlying motivation behind it? Then we have a chance of developing strategies to mitigate this adversarial, this adversarial advocacy against agriculture using technology. So that would be my ambition by trying to come to grips with it. Now, okay, so we're going to open up we're going to let several hounds loose here out of the kennel. One of them would be, what is it about GMO or gene editing that people find so offensive, and is that really well-founded, or sort of is it misguided? That would be one of the hounds that's running. We'll let another one out, and that'll be like, how is the anti-GMO position, how effective has it been, and what are the consequences, for the developing nations of the world in particular? And we need to talk about Africa, and we need to talk about Asia, because that's where most of the people in the world are going to live. Asia and Africa will be home to 8 out of every 10 people by the year 2100. 8 out of every 10 humans, living people on the planet, will live in Asia and Africa. And so these people are on the way. They're coming. And we have to be prepared. We have to set the table for them. And we must set the table for them. That's our obligation. So I want to explore that, how effective they've been and what's the consequence. And then maybe the third area the third hound that's out running that we'll chase around is what could be a solution, right? What could be a strategy to win the hearts and minds of people so that they will at best become advocates for highly intensive, eco-modern, technology-driven agriculture, and or at worst that they won't be opponents of it. So we could explore that. So we have sort of three balls up in the air here, and so let's pursue them a little. So GMOs, you know, they've been around a long time now, more than 20 years. You might not know, but we've planted and harvested and eaten 2.3 billion hectares of GMO crops in, let's say, in the last 2 decades. Last year alone, the world planted, the farmers of the world planted 196 million hectares of GMO crops. And they're entirely safe. No one has ever died of GMO crops, or gene editing crops, and food. And so with that knowledge, well, there was a very nice study done a few years ago. It's called the Trillion Meal Study. It's done by a very wonderful scientist. She's an Australian living in America, or maybe she's American now too, but her name's Alison Van Enneman, I think is the pronunciation, but forgive me if I'm wrong. But anyway, she's done remarkable work. But there's a trillion meal study that shows, you know, after a trillion meals of eating GMO foods, you know, we haven't had one health issue, not one death loss related to GMO. So how is something that's so safe, you know, and every scientific body of the world has approved their safety, okay? So that's already done and dusted. But yet the adoption is so bad, you know, around the world. We have, if you look at the map of the world, America, U.S. is the leader for using GM crops, thank goodness. But, you know, Europe is a disaster. It's a desert for GM and GE. When I say GM, I mean genetic modified. GE is genetic engineering. This is also part of the problem. The nomenclature is terrible for how these technologies are referred to. Maybe we'll chat about that as well. But so Europe's a desert because they politically don't want to grow GM crops, GMO crops, and then another desert for adoption is Africa, and in poor Africa, we'll talk about Africa, is also sort of bereft of using genetically engineered technology, and they are the ones who can benefit the most from it, you know. So it's a cruel irony, you know, that the people who need it the most, could benefit the most, don't have it available. And in Europe and Africa, the European continent and the African continent are, on this issue, are related to each other, and we'll talk about that under sort of this, under the mantle of the halo effect, and how our actions are not isolated. You know, what we do matters, and how we act matters, and how governments act and project matter, especially matter desperately to the poor nations of the world, the developing nations. So we're going to talk about that too. Okay, very good, very good. GMO, genetically modified organism. I mean, what the hell does that mean anyway? I mean, this is what I mean. It's so sloppy. The nomenclature is just a mess, you know, because it's not specific. You know, every living thing is genetically modified. Okay, so now you have a problem. You're going to talk about GMOs, but everything's a GMO. So you know what I mean? It's so general. It's really meaningless. Yeah, as an example, we people, you know, we are a GMO. Absolutely. Mitochondria, which is in the cell of every person, which generates energy, the ATP, originates from a bacteria. So we have a symbiotic evolutionary relationship with a bacteria that's in every one of our cells. It's been it's been calculated through, all the genomic work that we can do now. But, us humans, you'll like this with COVID going on, but, we have 8% of our DNA is from viruses. 8%. Retroviruses have been installing their genetic code into us, and we've evolved with them. So we are, and you can go on and on, we have bacteria DNA and from jumping genes, and you may have heard of those jumping genes, and from cisgene, transgene transfer, horizontal gene transfer. So anyway, this is the story of all life. And then, of course, man, for 10,000 years since we started practicing agriculture, we have been deliberately selecting and applying what we call genetic selective pressure to plants and to animals. The domestication of animals is entirely because of, man's manipulation of genetic selection, plants, crops, everything. So everything is a GMO. And then, so don't be alarmed about it, right? But, of course, we're going to talk about why, it's so goofy, why people are so scared of it. And we should understand, we have to think about why. Okay. But let's also consider something. Every bite of food you have ever eaten, ever eaten, every bite, every meal, every snack, you are consuming the DNA of other organisms, the plants, the meat, the animals, and don't forget the bacteria that resides on every peach or apple or on every piece of broccoli. Every time you wipe your hand on your mouth, whatever you're consuming, every breath you take, you're sucking in bacteria and virus. But let's just talk about meals. Every bite of food that you've ever digested has been full of foreign DNA. Okay, foreign genetic material. And so that hasn't transformed you into a piece of broccoli, or a carrot. You don't have orange skin. It hasn't, assume you've eaten chicken and you haven't grown wings. You eat fish and you haven't got a fin or gills. And I don't mean to be too facetious, but I do want to make the point that there's an intellectual disconnect between eating and consuming all of the food, every bite that you've ever taken, of millions of different DNA from foreign organisms. And there's a disconnect with saying, okay, now farmers and geneticists have modified the crop, let's just say it's corn, or it could be apples to preserve their or to resist a fungicide or something. But anyway, there's an intellectual disconnect between saying, okay, here I'm going to eat food that's been targeted by breeding to select beneficial traits so that the food is better and more resistant to the environmental stress or drought or whatever the case may be. And somehow that's dangerous, like it's scary and frightening and dangerous, and yet every food I've ever eaten is nothing but foreign DNA. You see what I mean? It's not intellectually consistent to be fearful of one and yet eat the other. Okay. So that is the sort of, well, we'll probably leave that one alone now. I think I made the point. But now I'd like to talk about the psychology of being against eating a genetically engineered food, GMO, GE, and in this desire to only eat what's called natural foods, or organic, organic food. Now, So, what's organic food? Again, it's another sloppy language. It's a lazy use of language, because organic food is every food. You cannot get non-organic food. Anything that contains carbon, right, has carbon in it, the element carbon, which is you could call the backbone of life. Anything containing carbon is organic. So every plant, every animal, every insect, every bacteria, everything's organic. And yet somehow this nomenclature is being applied to a section, a category of food that is produced in some special way that's supposedly, well, what? It's supposedly more healthy and better for people and the environment. And so we're going to talk about that because, well, it's absolutely critical that we talk about it. So, why is it that people are against GMOs? And very interesting. And then you see the active side of it. It's not only that you would be against GMO and genetically engineered food and biotechnology. You see, the same activists, when it becomes at an activism level, then it's actively working for an agenda, and that agenda is to increase the demand for these types of organic, natural foods. The agenda is to restrict the use of biotechnology, if not outright eliminate it. That's also part of the agenda. And then the third maybe piece of the agenda is to sort of, it's wrapped up with a sort of a romantic story about how farming could become, small and more local and sort of quintessentially romantic notion of farming, where you've got everything idyllic and green fields and butterflies and little red barns, and I don't know, everyone's so happy and well, it's a fantasy, it's a romantic fantasy that's baseless, and it'll do a terrible disservice to humanity if the active pressure to restrict biotechnology and actively trying to get it withdrawn from use, if that's successful, then we're going to have unbelievable suffering from an inability to feed people, from an inability of people to be able to afford to eat this food, whatever is available. It'll be much more expensive. And the environment will suffer. We will have to plow and burn and deforest and so much land because to farm in a regressive style, which is kind of what the natural organic farming principles, and now there's new language being brought in, or sort of new marketing around regenerative agriculture and agroecology, but anyway, these are what I would call regressive farming practices. The denial of tools and technology to help us be more efficient. and so they could have a tragic consequence. And the irony is that, and the consequence would be, ostensibly in the service of healthier people and better environment, which is what the embracing of technology will deliver, not the running away from it. Okay. So what is it